Hi everyone, the Partial Prophet here. Thanks for tuning in. So I wanted to remind you that we know in part and we prophesy in part, and then when Jesus comes, we will see fully. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Out of Time, Passover, Easter 2022, the prophetic fulfillments. Okay, so in one of my previous videos, I talked about Purim and some of the prophecies related to Purim. And it is the last festival of the Jewish year. So now we're in Passover, which would be the first festival of the Jewish year. Okay. So there's a lot of kind of shadows of new life with the Passover. It's definitely the holiday about, freedom from slavery in Egypt. And so I wasn't sure with Purim if we were going to see maybe Jesus return, because it was the last festival of the Jewish year. But now here we are in Passover, and I think I definitely think this is a high watch time for looking for the return of Jesus Christ. Okay, but some of the things in Purim. So what we had related to Purim is that the 2 years of wearing masks due to COVID in America ended on April 3rd or April 10th on the Hebrew calendar. So April 3rd, 2020 was when the CDC finally recommended that Americans should wear masks for COVID. And so then we hit the 2-year mark of that, the 2-year anniversary of that on April 3rd of this year. But if you follow the Hebrew date when that happened, that was on April 10th, which was Palm Sunday. And so that's interesting to me because Palm Sunday was the start of the Holy Week. And so you could say we had like a 2-year time frame, and then we entered into a 7-day time frame with Holy Week. Okay. And I think I talk a little bit about that later in the slides. And so then with Purim, so that holiday is definitely connected to the Book of Esther, and there's so many prophecies in the Book of Esther that I think we've been fulfilling in these days. Okay, so first off, we've had the rise of a Haman who wants to kill God's people. Okay, so we've seen that with Putin in this war with Russia against Ukraine, that Putin is just killing a lot of Ukrainians. And so he does have some similarities to Hitler. He is wanting to gain more land and gain more power, and he's not afraid to use any means at his disposal to accomplish what he's trying to accomplish. And so, definitely, definitely a Hitler type, okay, and a Haman type, definitely a Haman type who wants to kill God's people, okay. And so, what was interesting about the war is that started exactly 2 years after the shutdowns, probably on the Hebrew calendar, I believe. So exactly on the 2-year anniversary was when the war started, when Putin invaded Ukraine. So that's kind of interesting. So that's why, we kind of keep track of what's going on the 2-year anniversaries of things. Okay, and then what we've seen too is in the Book of Esther, we see Mordecai and Esther pleading for their people. Okay, and so we definitely see that being fulfilled through Zelensky as he goes from country to country to try to get help for Ukraine in this war. Okay. And then one of the other things that relates to the Book of Esther is it talks about gifts to poor people. And so we see that being fulfilled with people helping out the Ukrainians, giving humanitarian aid to the Ukrainians. So we see that happening. Okay, and then, so in the Book of Esther, in Esther 5:3, we read, "Then the king said to Esther, 'What is troubling you, Queen Esther, and what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be given to you.'" And what's interesting about this line where the king says, even to half of the kingdom it shall be given to you, it shows up 3 times in the book of Esther. Okay. And so the first time is here in Esther 5:3, and then the next 2 times are in the 2 banquets of Esther. Okay. So I definitely think that's some prophetic picture that God's painting with, the repeat of that statement of the king. Okay. And so what I think the way that it's being fulfilled right now is that we have like heads of state that are saying to Zelensky, let's say Queen Esther is a picture of Zelensky, and but the countries are saying to Zelensky, they're saying, well, we'll give you up to half of the kingdom, but we won't go any farther. Okay, so we'll help you with humanitarian aid and we'll give you weapons, but we're definitely not going to join this fight and help you defeat Russia. Okay, we have a red line up to where we'll help you, but we won't help you any further than that. Okay, so that's what's happening with the various countries, and we definitely see that with Israel and America. Okay, and so Zelensky went to he talked to the Knesset about getting weapons, and so I think he did that on March 20th, and then on March 22nd, Israel's Prime Minister Bennett said that ultimately Bennett's responsible for Israel, and that apparently that means he's not responsible for helping out Ukraine. That his ultimate responsibility is Israel, and so that was basically what he said in saying no, he's not going to give weapons to Ukraine. See, the situation that Israel is in right now is that they don't want to get Russia mad because they have been working with Russia in Syria to have free reign in Syria to go after Iran when Iran's trying to set up weapons and proxies and stuff in Syria. So they don't want to mess up their relationship with Russia. Okay. So that's the reason. It's not an excuse because I don't think it's a good excuse. Okay. So what was very interesting about this is that the exact day after Prime Minister Bennett made this comment was the start of the terrorist attacks in Israel. And so they've been having sort of non-ending terrorist attacks in Israel. Okay. So that's what's going on in Israel. And then in America, on March 16th, Zelensky talked to Congress. Okay. And same thing, asked for help from America. And, he brought up, when he was talking to Congress, he brought up Pearl Harbor and 9/11, like compared what was happening in Ukraine to 9/11 and Pearl Harbor, to kind of relate to, to help the Americans relate to what was happening in Ukraine. Okay. So my question is, so ever since then, we've been seeing weekly tornadoes and storms in America. So is that judgment on America for Biden not willing to help out Israel? Okay, so that's kind of the question I have. And then what we see is that Biden is willing to speak strongly against Putin, but he won't involve America militarily. Okay. And so the other prophecy that I think that's being fulfilled is that we see in the book of Esther in the first chapter that Vashti was not willing to come with her royal crown on the 7th day. Okay. So what we have is, I believe that Biden is the 7th king, and I talk about that in my previous videos. So that would make this the 7th day. And so Vashti, who has a royal crown, is a picture of America with, obviously God has blessed us with military power. And we're not willing right now with the current administration to bring our military power into the situation with Russia. Okay. And so then basically what's happening is then the Ukrainians are getting killed. They're not getting the help that they need against Russia. Okay. Um, and then what we see in the Book of Esther is that Vashti ends up getting executed, and the Jewish people have a belief. The rabbis that believe that she was executed on Nisan 15, which is today. Okay, the day before Easter. Okay, on the Hebrew calendar. Okay, so very interesting. Okay, so then, so I think we could be seeing judgment coming for Putin. I mean, not Putin, Biden. Well, Putin too, but Biden. Okay, because I think we're fulfilling, he's fulfilling the Vashti prophecy. Okay. And so we read in Psalm 78:9, it says, the sons of Ephraim were archers equipped with bows, yet they turned back in the day of battles. So I think that could be talking about America. It could also be talking about Israel, even though I tend to look at Ephraim being more connected to, because he's the son of Joseph, kind of connected to the Americans, rather than the Jewish people in Israel. But it could have a dual fulfillment. So we're definitely seeing fulfillment of prophecies in these days. Okay. And then I wanted to bring up this psalm, Psalm 106, connected to kind of the last slide, what we just talked about. Psalm 106:34 says, they did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but they mingled with the nations and learned their practices and served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and daughters to the demons and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with the blood. So what we see is, so what we see Israel mingling with Russia, okay? And, so Russia's going to become a snare to them, because they're not, willing to help Ukraine against Russia, okay? And then, so, I mean, right now, Russia's being a snare to Israel because Israel's not acting correctly in this, with this war. They're not helping out Ukraine, okay? So they're going to get blood on their hands, okay? And so I added in here too, so the beast from the sea has feet like a bear. And then in Proverbs, we read about the bear being a rushing bear, which is kind of interesting. And so we've, have heard people kind of refer to Russia as the bear. Okay. So what I think is that the current administration in Israel have feet like a bear, okay, because they're acting more like Russia than they're walking with Russia during this time of the war with Ukraine, rather than walking with the Ukrainians and helping the Ukrainians. Okay. And then we see a similar situation with America, with Iran. For whatever reason, the current government in America is not willing to really put their foot down with Iran. Okay, they're really trying to. I mean, with this whole Iran deal and trying to renew the JCPOA, America has been more than willing to let Iran sort of get away with murder. Well, I shouldn't even say sort of. They are getting away with murder because of all their terrorist proxies. I mean, with the Iran deal and all the negotiations, they were really ignoring all the fact that Iran was supporting all these proxies that were attacking people in Iraq and Yemen and Israel. And, so So America has blood on their hands too from not willing to stand up with Iran. And also with the Iran deal, America was getting to the point where they were going to be willing, Biden seemed to be willing to drop the IRCG, the Iranian military off of the terrorist lists, just so they can get this deal, um, nailed down. Okay, but he got a lot of flack for that, and so I believe like soon after his administration was considering it, they got so much flack that they dropped the idea. Okay, but they're just not really willing to deal with Iran like it really needs to be dealt with. Okay, because it's an evil regime, um, and it needs to be stopped. Okay, and so in Esther, so let's read this in Esther 4. Um, it says, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. Then Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish. And she sent garments to clothe Mordecai that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept. Then Esther summoned Hatach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. So Hatach went out to Mordecai to the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her, and to order her to go into the king to employ his favor and to plead with him for her people. Okay, so I definitely believe this is being fulfilled, and that I believe that Zelensky is being a Mordecai type figure. And so it's interesting because we're really repeating history. The same thing happened with World War II. We had Churchill was going from country to country, trying to get Europe to join the war to fight against Hitler. And really, no one, people were really slow in listening to Churchill. And then we have the same problem with Zelensky, that he's going from country to country trying to get help, and people are being slow to respond. I mean, people are quick to respond with humanitarian aid, but no one wants to get involved militarily. Okay. And so if you were to go read this Zelensky speech to the Knesset that he gave on March 20th, like it's almost like eerily very similar to this passage in Esther. So I definitely see a very strong fulfillment of prophecy, because we saw that Zelensky, like it talks about Mordecai giving him a copy of the text of the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction. We almost see Zelensky speaking somewhat prophetically in his speech to the Knesset. Okay. And then, Zelensky brought up the Holocaust, and said this situation is similar to the Holocaust. And Israel didn't like that. They rejected his comparisons to the Holocaust. But I really think he's onto something, because it's about an innocent group of people getting killed for, no other reason than, a guy who has delusions of grandeur and wants land and power. Okay. A crazy guy that, so that happened with Hitler. He was a crazy guy, and there wasn't anyone really willing to stand up to him. And so we see the repeat of history with Putin. Okay. And so I put in this verse down here. Deuteronomy 24:22, it says, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I'm commanding you to do this thing." And the context is helping the poor. Okay. And so the problem that we have with Israel is that they're forgetting that they were once a slave in the land of Egypt. They're forgetting that they were once in a similar situation, that they were a helpless people in need of someone to come help them so that they wouldn't get killed. And they're forgetting their history, and so they're not recognizing the Ukrainians are in a similar situation, that they're a helpless people that there were poor people that need help against Putin. Okay, um, so that's what's going on. And then Okay, so then the verses in Esther go on and says, Hattak came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hattak and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." Okay. Um, so what I believe is that um, this is a warning to Prime Minister Bennett that just because he's in the land of Israel, he shouldn't imagine that he can escape the current season of God's people being attacked by their enemies, any more than like the people in Ukraine. Okay. Um, um, I mean, Bennett needs to be careful and not think that, he's really standing, like his faith is in the military power of Israel, and he needs to be careful because that's not going to keep him safe. Um, um, and so what's interesting is that Mordecai said, Esther says in these verses, she said, he'll be put to death, I'll be put to death, or someone will be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter. Okay, so what we see with Israel is this picture of they're more willing to, they want the golden scepter of Russia held out to them, and that's where their faith is in, more than the faith in God. Okay. And they don't want to mess that up. They still want the golden scepter. They want the permission of Russia to be able to go into Syria. Um, um, and so Bennett needs to be careful because, God could bring judgment for Bennett not helping the Ukrainians. Okay. Because then what does Mordecai say? Relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. Okay. So if Bennett doesn't help, then God has to send another helper. Okay. Okay. And then, and then let's talk about the prophecies that we're seeing fulfilled that relate to the holiday of Passover. So what I think is really interesting is that right before the holiday of Passover, the Jewish people have a tradition. I mean, it comes from, it comes from, God calls the Jewish people to not eat leavening during the holiday of Passover, or during the holiday of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so the Jewish people clean out leavening before the holiday. Okay. And so it's interesting because I believe we see that being fulfilled in our day. Okay, so one way we see that being fulfilled, like that picture of cleaning out leavening before Passover, we're seeing that fulfilled right now in Israel. Right now they're doing this Operation Waves Breaker. Okay, and basically what it is because the terrorist attacks have ramped up in Israel. Israel really kind of put their foot down and decided that they were going to go strong against these terrorists. And so the government has given the IDF and the other military forces pretty much free reign um, to go round up these terrorists and put a stop to them. Okay. And they call that Operation Waves Breaker. Okay. Well, so what's interesting about the tradition of the Jewish people cleaning out the leavening in their home is that so the Jewish people, they try to like vacuum, like they're trying to get breadcrumbs and cookie crumbs and anything that might have yeast or um, baking soda in it. They're trying to clean that up. Okay, well, if you've ever tried to clean your house of breadcrumbs and cookie crumbs, you would learn sometime along while you're doing it that it's kind of an impossible task to get every single crumb out of your house, especially if you have kids. And so part of the tradition too is that at the Seder, so they leave a few crumbs out. And then at the Seder, the father of the household will sweep up the remaining crumbs. Okay. And so, really, what we learn from this picture is that um, if you see leavening being a picture of our enemies, we can, as much work as we try to put in eliminating our enemies, we can't eliminate them without God's help. Okay. And so we are going to need God to come and rescue us from our enemies. Okay. And so the message is we can't get all the leavening, we need God's help. Okay. And so what we have is all the leaders in Israel talk about their military strength and their normalization efforts with their neighbors, that is what's going to bring them peace and safety, but that is not correct. Okay, the Bible says that only God can bring peace. Okay, so the leaders in Israel are relying on the wrong thing. Okay, they're not relying on God. They're relying on their military strength and their ability to negotiate with their neighbors and make deals with their neighbors. Okay, but it's a false peace. Okay, and then we see the same picture in America where we have seen the January 6th Commission in America is trying to deal with the Trump followers that, were involved in the January 6th riot at the Capitol. Okay, so that's a picture of cleaning out the leavening. Okay, so that's the American picture. Okay, so what I think is interesting too, connected to this prophecy about cleaning out the leavening, or this shadow and picture about cleaning out the leavening, is that we see, okay, so remember the sheep and the goat story, that, the parable of the sheep and the goats that Jesus told in the Gospels. Um, and, so I think that's a connection to, okay, so what I believe is that the war in Ukraine is revealing who is a sheep and who is a goat. Okay. Because what we see in the sheep and the goat story is that Jesus, okay, so it says in Matthew 25, it says, then they themselves also will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you? Then he will answer them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. These will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Okay. So the goats are saying, well, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty? And it'd be Jesus saying, well, you didn't help out the least of those in Ukraine, you know? And so then um so then this war is helping to reveal who is a sheep and who is a goat, who would be put on the right of Jesus or who would be put on the left. Okay. Um, so, and then we read that the goats are the ones that go away into eternal punishment. Okay. So the goats are the ones, so really God is revealing what's in their heart. And, do they care for and love God's people and want to help God's people? Or could they care less? Okay, and are they ignoring the cry of God's people? Okay. Okay. So then I wanted to bring this up because I made a video about some of the prophecies in Back to the Future. And, so I got to thinking about um, the 9/11 clues in Back to the Future. And I was like, is there a connection to this holiday of Passover? Okay, to this, to the time frame that we're currently in. Okay. So one thing that I thought was interesting is that, and obviously we know in part and we prophesy in part. So I may not be totally seeing clearly what the prophecy is showing, but we've already seen how Back to the Future had 9/11 clues in it. Um, before 9/11 actually happened in 2001. Okay. And so I was wondering if there's some hidden clues about the final 9/11 event when I believe Jesus is coming back. Okay. And so what's interesting, so we already saw that, with this sign in the movie with the Twin Pines Mall where it says 116, when you turn it around, it says 9/11. Okay. Well, so one thought I had is, well, what if you don't turn it around and you're looking at 116? Okay. Is 116 a potential date for looking for the final ultimate 9/11 event? Okay. Of history, of prophetic history. Okay. And so actually I went back and watched this scene again. And when Marty's walking up to the sign initially says 115 and you see it switched to 116. Okay. And so what's interesting about that is that today, okay, so Passover Eve starts on the first month on the Jewish calendar and the 14th day. The first full day of Passover is the first month, the 15th day. And then the second day of Passover would be the first month, the 16th day. Okay. And so, what if the midnight hour between um, Nisan 15 and Nisan 16 is when 9/11 starts? What if that's the time frame that we're looking for, is the changing from 115 to 116? Okay. And so then that would make Easter. Easter is Nisan 16 this year. Okay. That could make Easter a potential 9/11 day. Okay. Um, and that could make midnight in between, um, Good Saturday and Easter a high watch time. Okay. So, I mean, I guess we'll find out really soon because it's coming, you know, I don't know what, in 5 hours or something. So I guess we'll find out. So that was one thing that I'm looking at. Um, and then if not, then, we'll have to see what other, like maybe what other clues we might find in this movie. Um, um, so, okay, so Easter is Nisan 16. What's interesting about Nisan 16, it's that it's also a third day. So it kind of relates to being a third day because you got Good Friday, Good Saturday, and then Easter. Okay. I mean, it could be sort of considered a third day of Passover, even though it's really kind of the second day of Passover, but like the evening's kind of like the third day of Passover. But you have Passover Eve, Passover day 1, and Passover day 2. Okay. Or wait, I didn't count that right. Passover Eve is 1, Passover day 1 is 2, and then Passover day 2 is 3. Okay, like that's not confusing. So you could maybe get a third day that way. Okay. But it's also an 8th day if you consider the week of Holy Week. Okay. So yeah, the Holy Week starts on Palm Sunday and then goes through Holy Saturday. And then the next day is Easter. Tomorrow is Easter, would be an 8th day. Okay. And so because I'm definitely looking for an 8th day. Okay, I talked about 2022 being the year of the 8th king. Okay, and so we're looking for something that fulfills the prophecy of the 8th day. The third, there's a lot of prophecies too about the third day resurrection happening on the third day, circumcision happening on the 8th day, and so I think Easter's a high watch day because it's fulfilling a third day and it's fulfilling an 8th day. Okay. And the Jewish people have a lot of, on their calendar, they believe a lot of things in the Jewish history happened on Nisan 15, and then a lot of things happened on Nisan 16. Okay. So it's definitely, these 2 days are really definitely high watch days. Okay. Um, And then what was interesting too, another 9/11 sign. Remember the Notre Dame fire back in 2019? Okay. Had a lot of similarities to 9/11, where you had the people in the city, watching it burn. They were as shocked, as the people in New York City when the Twin Towers were burning. Okay. So it was definitely a 9/11 type event in France. Okay. Um, what was interesting is that happened on April 15th through the 16th. The fire burned those 2 days. Okay. And so we see those numbers, the 15th and the 16th, there too. Okay. And it was actually, but on the Hebrew calendar, it was actually Nisan 10 to 11. Okay. Um, which, that's kind of interesting because 11, I always look at 11 because I think 11 is the number of judgment. Okay. And that connects to 9/11 because the two towers look like 11. And then after this fire, too, you had the two towers. The spire burnt down and, burnt and fell over. But then you still had two towers standing, okay, after this fire. And then what was interesting is the third day that week, so we had the fire on the 15th and the 16th. And then on the third day, April 17th, someone tried to set fire to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. Okay. So to me, that's fascinating. That's a third day on April 17th. Okay. Which I believe is the day of Easter. Okay. Um, so, um, yeah, that's tomorrow, April 17th. Okay. Um, so did God give us some prophetic signs in the Notre Dame fire about what was to come? Okay. And what was interesting is that happened 3 years ago. So was it the 3-year warning about, a possible 9/11 event on April 17th of this year? Okay. Possibly. We'll see what happens. Okay. Because what's interesting is that Notre Dame means Our Lady, okay? And then it happened in France, and France has 6 letters. Okay, so if you know that I'm looking for the return of Trump, if I'm looking for the return of the 6th king, okay, that's why it's interesting to me that France has 6 letters, okay? Um, and then, you know, so what I'm wondering is that with Notre Dame meaning Our Lady, is the fire of the Notre Dame fire, is it a picture of the judgment of the great harlot of Babylon? Okay. And what's interesting about the judgment of Babylon, the judgment of the harlot, it happens in Revelation 17 and 18, the 17th and the 18th chapters. Okay. And so what we have is Easter's on the 17th and Easter Monday's on the 18th. Okay. So is that those are high watch dates maybe for the possible fulfillment of the judgment of Babylon, the judgment of the harlot. Okay. um and then I thought it was kind of interesting too that because the spire falling could be symbolic of the firstborn falling. Okay, so if you understand that right now we're in a greater Exodus cycle, okay, and then God's been bringing his plagues because there's been fires and hurricanes and tornadoes and terrorist attacks and plagues and the coronavirus and stuff happening in all the countries in the world, okay. um and so that's been happening for a while, okay. So we've been fulfilling those prophecies of the Passover Exodus, okay. And then one of the last plagues that he brings is the judgment of the firstborn, okay. So if you understand that the firstborn is right now God's enemies are the ones in control of everything. Okay. So they are the firstborn right now. Like Trump and his followers would be the firstborn, and they're, kind of running the churches and running things. And then we have the left would be, the firstborn, the people on the left that are running things. Okay. So what happens is that in the judgment of, the firstborn, God comes and he brings judgment on the firstborn, which is the people that are running everything, and he does a reversal of fortune. And so right now God's people are the the poor and the meek and the ones like in the dust, you know. And and so then he's going to do a reversal of fortune, and he's going to rise up his people, and he's going to bring his enemies down, okay. So the spire falling could be symbolic of the firstborn falling, okay. And we also see kind of a connection to like Samson and the two pillars, okay. I got those verses coming up. um so yeah. So what I wrote, third day in America, New York City, because like NYC could connect to third day. And then we see kind of a connection to the three-sided shamrock because it was at St. Patrick's Cathedral, okay. And I talked about how like St. Patrick and the three-sided shamrock could connect to Trump because I believe he's the 666 guy, okay. um and so so we'll see what happens. Okay, and so some other Passover prophecies. So I already talked about this, that we're seeing. Okay, so we're in a greater Exodus cycle, and one of the things that we're seeing too is this exodus of people from Ukraine, okay, returning to Israel, okay. So that's very interesting, okay. Um, Another Passover prophecy, when the Jewish people do the Seder, they mention all the biblical events, at least in the what they call the Tanakh, or in their Bible, all the biblical events that happen at midnight. And I mean, there's probably some in the New Testament too that happen at midnight. And so that makes midnight kind of a high watch time, okay, because there's so many biblical events. And if you think of those as being, prophecies that are yet to be fulfilled, we can expect something big to happen at midnight, okay. Um, and then also in Back to the Future 2, in that movie, so what happened in that movie is that there's three um there's three time frames. There's actually more, I think, in that movie, but it starts out with three different time frames. So first Marty's in the present, and then him and Doc go to the future, and then they end up in this alternate reality, okay. And so what's interesting is the alternate reality is the third time frame in the second movie. Okay, the second movie was released on 11/22/1989. So I'm wondering if the 22 is a prophetic picture of 2022, and are we going to see fulfillments of this third time frame in this movie connected to 2022? Okay, are we going to see a type of alternate reality happening in 2022? And I think we might see that, okay. I mean, so one of the things is that the third time frame connects to the time of Biden, because we got Obama is the first time frame, Trump is the second time frame, Biden is the third time frame. Okay. Um, um, Daniel's three friends in the fiery furnace could represent the third time frame. And so what we have is Doc, Marty, and Jennifer in Back to the Future 2 are like the three, could represent the three people, or the third time frame. And so what we see, okay, I think I talk about it on this slide. So what we see in this movie is kind of a repeat of, we see kind of a picture of like the rioting that we saw back in the time of Trump, like the BLM riots, okay? But what we also see in this time frame is, so we see Biff's tower, okay? Definitely lots of prophetic shadows to Trump and his tower. And what's interesting about Biff's tower is that he welcomes the bikers, okay? So we saw Trump saying that QAnon were good people. He says the January 6th people are good people, and so, we see Biff in the Back to the Future movie, who's a powerful, rich man, at least in this third time frame, is a friend of the, just kind of like the not good people, because and so Trump, he's friends with the shady people in the world, including Putin. He's not willing to say that Putin is evil. So definitely kind of interesting. And then we also see, okay, so the Twin Pines Mall changes to the Lone Pine Mall. And so I think we're going to see, so 9/11 is like a picture of one of the pines falling, okay, or one of the towers falling, okay. And so what I believe is that we have like a tower on the right and a tower on the left. I mean, it's a picture of the Civil War. It's like the North Tower and the South Tower of 9/11, okay? And they end up falling, and then one tower rises in its place, okay? But in this movie, we see the Twin Pine Mall changes to the Lone Pine Mall, okay? And then it's like Marty returns, and okay, so what does it say? 9/11 sign, because the Twin Towers fell and were rebuilt to be the One World Trade Center. And then in here, I talk about how we see that number 1335, which is in the book of Daniel. Okay, so if you have Marty being the 5, we're seeing the number 1335. And I've always connected 1335 to time, times, and half a time. And so what I believe is that, so I think time would connect to Trump's first term. Okay, the times connect to the 2 terms of Obama and Biden. Okay, the first time around that Obama, and his first time around, Obama was president for 8 years, and then now we have Biden. And then, so then what I think is we're waiting for this half a time fulfillment. Okay, and that connects to the number 5. Okay, and so it's also called like the dividing of time in scripture. And so I think a lot of numbers of 50, because I think Haman builds a gallows 50 cubits high. Whenever you see the number 5 or the number 50, I think it could be a prophetic shadow to this half the time. Okay. I also talked about how there's other 9/11 signs in this picture, because we have Doc with his hands up. We have the reflection of the headlights is a picture of, kind of like the 11, um, um, and then even in front of the truck, we see the reflection of the headlights, so we see a repeat of that 9/11 picture kind of all throughout this one screen, so definitely very interesting. So um, So, well, like I said, Marty returns. Okay. And then in Daniel, we see how blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end, then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. Okay. So we want to wait for the we want to wait and attain for the 1335 days. Okay. Um, and then this is another picture from Back to the Future, the 9/11 picture where the 9 is on the Western auto. You can't really see it in this picture; it's kind of cut off. But the 9 is heavenly. The 11 is earthly. Okay. So I think this could be a picture kind of like after the 9/11, where like God's people, if they're the heavenly, then they're like raised up, and then the 11, the twin towers are now fallen. Okay. So the militant on the right and the militant on the left are now fallen. Okay. Um, and then, so then you're out of time if the militant on the right and the militant on the left have fallen. That's what this picture is. Um, um, and then I wanted to bring this out was the Trump Tower. The blaze broke out on the 50th floor. So remember I said that, look for 50. It could connect to this times and half the time. Okay. So this is definitely a 9/11 picture too, because we had things falling out the windows like in 9/11. I mean, only one person got killed, I think, in this fire. But it's still a huge 9/11 picture. And then, so definitely a connection to Samson. We see, they made Samson stand between the pillars. Okay, Samson in verse 29 it says, which 29 adds up to 11, by the way. Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested and braced himself against them, the one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bent with all his might, so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. Okay, so um, I think Samson is a picture of Trump in these verses. Okay, and so we're going to see Trump say, "Let me die with the Philistines." Okay, and so what we're going to see is that Trump and his followers are going to go against Biden and his followers, and in the process, really everyone ends up being killed. All of God's enemies end up, I think they end up killing each other, you know and kind of do a lot of the cleanup work for God. So that's what I think is going to happen. I talked about these verses in a couple other videos too. Um, and then the cupbearer and the baker, remember that it's on the third day, and that God like talks about on the third day, the cupbearer ends up being able to bring the cup, and put it into the king's hands again on the third day. And the baker ends up getting hung on a tree on the third day. Okay. So I definitely think, see, the cupbearer gets to return to his previous position. So I think that could be a picture of Trump. I mean, it could also be a picture of Jesus returning to on the third day. Okay, returning to his previous position, and bringing judgment. Okay, but I think it's also, it's probably dual fulfillment. And then the baker. So let's talk about the baker, because he has 3 baskets of bread on his head. Okay, what's interesting is that Russia and Ukraine are considered the breadbasket of the world, okay, because they grow grain, okay? And so what we see on the baker's head, the third basket represents the third time frame. Okay, remember I said Obama, Trump, Biden were in the third time frame, okay? And then since the birds are eating the bread, which is a picture of Russia attacking the Ukrainians. So if you think of the bread being God's people, and birds are eating God's people during the third time frame. And basically what happens is Biden ends up bearing responsibility because, the baskets are on his head. And so he is supposed to be a leader and he's supposed to be keeping the bread safe on his head with his authority, basically. He's supposed to be keeping the bread safe, but instead the birds are eating them. And so then it means that Biden's going to get judged. And you know how God kind of talks about, like, if, people take people captive, to captivity they will go. If people kill with the sword, they'll be killed by the sword. And so since Biden's allowing the bread to get eaten by the birds, Biden's going to get judged and birds are going to eat his flesh. He's going to hang on a tree and birds are going to eat his flesh. Okay. So that's some prophecies that are to come. Okay. I wanted to bring this up because I thought this was interesting. The image of the beast. Okay, I got to thinking about this. I don't remember what made me think of this, but I realized, okay, so this is talking about, okay, this comes from the Revelation 13. And remember, there's the beast from the earth and then the beast from the sea. Okay, I mean, it starts out with the beast from the sea and then it talks about the beast from the earth. And it's the beast from the earth that kind of puts up this image to the beast. Okay, so let's read these. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which it was given him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Okay, so I think what I believe the image of the beast is that it's this narrative that the image is the narrative that Trump spins about Biden stealing the election. Okay, the narrative is going to cause Trump's people to rise up and kill Biden's followers. Okay, and so because it talks about the beast from the earth is making an image to the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. So I talked about how, originally, Obama and Biden, had the head wound, which is a picture of like the authority being wounded when Trump came to power. Okay. And so they lost that power. They lost their power when Trump came to power. But then God allowed Biden to return to power. Okay. And so there was a healing of the head wound. Okay. And so Trump ends up making an image to Biden, who is the one who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. Okay. And then Trump gives breath to his image, to its narrative, so that this image causes the Trump followers to actually rise up in rebellion against Biden. Okay. And so we see that in another story in scripture where Trump is like David's son who stole the people's heart away from the rightful ruler. So David was the rightful ruler, and his son, I think it might have been Absalom, was standing at the gate, like telling the people, like, well, if I was king, that wouldn't be happening if I was king. And so David's son ended up stealing the people's heart away. Okay, we see the exact same thing happening with Trump, where he's standing at the city gate telling people, well, if I was president, I wouldn't have allowed the war to start. I wouldn't have allowed the stuff in Afghanistan to happen. Okay, so Trump is stealing away the people's hearts. Okay, and so then this is gonna cause his people to want to rise up, and fight against Biden's followers. Okay, and so this prophetic story also connects to the story of Moses lifting up the bronze serpent on the pole. Okay, so I talk about in Daniel's statue, that Biden, um, that Obama is the belly of the beast, so he's connected to the bronze part of the statue, and then so Biden's also connected to the bronze part of the statue. So the bronze serpent on the pole is a prophetic picture of Biden getting crucified on the tree. Okay, so Trump is going to cause Biden to get crucified. Okay. Um, and then also in the book of John, we see some other Passover prophecies. Okay. So then in John 13, it says, when Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, truly I say to you that one of you will betray me. Jesus then answered, that is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him. So when he had dipped the morsel, he took and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, what you do, do quickly. Okay, I'm just doing a really quick overview because we could spend a long time just on this chapter alone. But basically, Jesus was saying one of his followers is going to betray him. Okay. And Jesus said it was the one whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him. Okay. So then it says when he had dipped the morsel. So the way prophecy works is that even in the same verse, you could switch who the characters are. And so the person dipping the morsel could be Biden dipping the morsel. Okay. He's causing the Ukrainians to get killed. Okay. So then Biden ends up giving the morsel to Judas, who is Trump. Okay. And then Trump's people rise up in rebellion because of the war. And I'm wondering too if because of the threat of nuclear weapons from Russia, which just happened yesterday, um, um, we heard about that, or it happened this week basically, that we heard, that, well, I think it was yesterday that where Russia actually threatened America and said, stop giving Ukraine weapons, or you're in trouble, you know. And, so what we're seeing is America is now in a precarious position, because of, they're because they're willing to give up half the kingdom but not the whole kingdom to go against Russia, and so that's putting America in a precarious position. Okay. And so all this escalation of bad things happening under Biden um, could be adding to the ire of Trump and his followers, to cause them to want to rise up. Okay. And start the civil war in America. Okay. And so then what we see is that after the morsel, Satan then enters into him. So Satan's going to enter into Trump. And we also read about that in Revelation 3 with 3 frogs that, draw people together for the war. And so Satan enters into Trump and his followers because of the war in Ukraine and other things. And then Jesus says, what you do, do quickly. So Trump is only going to have a short amount of time to accomplish what he wants to try to accomplish, which is civil war and destruction, basically. And then also, too, while we're talking about Passover prophecies, I'll just bring this up because I just kind of thought about it too. So on Nisan 14, so the Jewish people pick out their Passover lamb on the 10th of Nisan and then end up killing it on Nisan 14, or sacrificing it on Nisan 14. So what was interesting is that yesterday on Good Friday was Nisan 14. Okay. And so what we saw in Israel was the Palestinians rioting on the Temple Mount. Okay. Um, um, and so, you know, I mean, I'm assuming it made it difficult for, I didn't see anyone talking about this, but I'm sure it made it difficult for people that wanted to pray at the Western Wall. Okay. Um, and then, um, oh, what was the other thing? And then, like I said, also on Good Friday was when we got the threat from Putin toward Israel. Okay. I mean, toward America. Okay. So definitely seeing some connections to the Passover lamb yesterday. Um, um, okay, so I don't know if there's anything else I wanted to say about that, but we'll start with that. Okay. And then in Matthew, okay, so some other Passover prophecies in the Gospels, we get this one from Matthew. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. At that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to him, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that because of envy they had handed him over. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. But the governor said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Okay, so I think there's some prophetic shadows in here where I think Barabbas is a picture of Trump, the insurrectionist. Okay, because Barabbas was an insurrectionist. Um, and I think it's this picture of where we're going to see people calling for Trump, which we're seeing that already. If you watch any of the videos of the Trump followers, they've been calling for Trump to return as president for a really long time. Okay. And so I think this is interesting that this is connected to Passover. Are we going to see the return of Trump, the insurrectionist? Are we going to see him, be set free, like the cupbearer during Passover? Okay. So I've been looking for Trump to return on the 8th day. So Easter could be a possible fulfillment of the 8th day. The 8th day of Passover is another potential watch date if it doesn't happen tonight and tomorrow. But some of the other things won't work then. But on April 23rd, that is also Nisan 22. So that's the 8th day of Passover. So that's a possible day to look for the return of the 8th king, to look for the return of Trump. But then I don't know how that's a third day. So that's a possible day. And then, yeah. So what's kind of interesting in these verses is that, okay, it says the chief priest and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas. So what's interesting is the chief priest and the elders would be a picture of the firstborn, okay? The ones in charge, okay? The ones running the church, churches, the ones running the synagogues, ones running the political, the political leaders, okay? And so it's interesting that, they're the ones calling for, Barabbas, okay? And then wanting Jesus to be put to death, okay? So, this is a picture too of like, where Jesus says to Peter, you're, I'm, after the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times, okay? So we have these people that are willing to deny or crucify Jesus to get Barabbas, to get Trump, you know, to call for Trump instead. Okay. And so what I think is, so the last Passover, so one other, huge Passover prophecy, obviously, is the connection to the Red Sea crossing. Okay. And so what I believe is that we have kind of like the Sea of Obama on the left, Sea of Obama, Biden on the left, like the people and their belief system and their religion on the left. And then the Sea of Trump would be on the right, his followers, religion, etc. And in the middle is where you find the dry land with Messiah. And what we saw is at the Red Sea crossing, we saw Moses saying, "Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord." So what we have is people on the right and people on the left wanting to, by their own power, usher in their utopian worldview. And what we're taught in the Bible is that we're supposed to, if we are followers of Jesus and followers of God, we're supposed to stand by and wait for God to bring salvation. Okay. I mean, if you read the Psalms, it's all about God doing the work. Okay. setting us free. Okay, setting us free from Egypt. Okay, so that's what we want to do, is stand by and see the salvation of the Lord. Okay, we don't need to join in the civil war. We just need to stand by, and God will protect us and put us in a Sukkot booth. But also the Passover picture. The Passover picture is also a picture of God's protection. Okay, the blood of the lamb on the door, is the Passover protection. Very similar to, like, in Sodom and Gomorrah, they couldn't find the door. Okay, so if you have Jesus's blood on the door, if you're abiding in Jesus and he's protecting you, then while this civil war is going on, people will die at your left and your right, and it won't touch you. Okay. And one last thought too I wanted to bring up about Passover is that the Jewish people teach that Passover is like an 8-day holiday, because they consider it like there's one day of Passover and then there's 7 days of unleavened bread. And so I'm kind of wondering, they consider today, Nisan 15, to be the first day of Passover. And then the second day of Passover would be on Easter. So what if, it just kind of has to do with how they interpret what God says in the scriptures. Okay. So what if we're having one day of Passover today, and then if Jesus returns at midnight, then we're starting the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because the picture with the unleavened bread is that, okay, so leavening causes bread to rise. Okay. And so the Jewish people say it's a picture of pride. Okay. And so obviously, people that don't follow God are very prideful. They don't think they need a heavenly Father to help them. Okay. And so, so what we have is, like, Trump would be the boastful guy, who, has a lot of pride, as opposed to Messiah, who is, Jesus, who is, humbly following God. Okay. And then it's the prideful people that are in rebellion against God. Okay. And, don't think they need to follow his laws. Okay. So, so what if we have one day of Passover, and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread would be the 7 days while Messiah is here? So that's a possible fulfillment. Okay. We eat Jesus's unleavened bread for 7 days. Okay. And then probably for the rest of eternity too, but 7 days during the feast. Okay. So that was one thing that I was wondering. So we'll just have to see what happens. So like I said, I think we're nearing the end. I think, people that don't follow God could be out of time, or we could see, if we see the tower on the right and the tower on the left burning, we could see Jesus, who was kind of a little out of time, because he's heavenly, kind of in the middle of the tower burning on the left and the tower burning on the right. So that's what I'm wondering. And so that I just wanted to bring some of those prophetic pictures that I think we're fulfilling right now to you. And so, if the prophecies that I'm seeing between Nisan 15 and Nisan 16 don't come true, then I'll have to revisit it and bring you a new video. But thanks for tuning in. I just, hopefully this is encouraging to you, because hopefully you'll see that we're fulfilling prophecy and that God hasn't forgotten about his people, and that at some point we'll see judgment on the firstborn, with the firstborn being the rulers of the world right now, and a reversal of fortune for God's people, where they, will then have the leadership positions. Okay. So hopefully you see that, and especially with the birth pangs. I kind of went over it quickly, but was it Esther was writhing in pain? That's a picture of the birth pangs. Definitely, I don't know about you, but I definitely believe we're in the birth pangs, and that, because things are happening like every day. Okay. So same thing, even, this weekend, storms over this weekend. There was a mall shooting in South Carolina. Um, so similar to Israel and similar to America, where there's bad things going on in Israel, there's bad things going on in America. I mean, bad things going on in Ukraine, bad things going on in China. They're in major lockdown in China. So definitely, I see birth pangs around the world. Okay, so definitely, in the last days. So definitely, I think we can look up. Jesus said, when you see all these things happening, look up, for your redemption draws nigh. And so if you aren't encouraged, one thing, I'll bring this up in the Seder. You kind of mix the bitter herbs. Okay, so the Seder is what the Jewish people do for Passover. And, I don't know if you've seen like a Seder plate that has, all these different elements. And so the Jewish people, they eat bitter herbs and unleavened bread for their Seder. But then there's been a lot of elements that have joined the Seder throughout the years. Okay. And so the bitter herbs, okay, so they like dip herbs in salt water, and that represents the tears of, the tears that happen for God's people while they're in slavery. And then like they'll eat a piece of romaine lettuce, and you eat it from the top to the bottom, and it's like not so bad at the beginning. It's not hard at the beginning, but it gets harder near the bottom of it. And so that's a picture of like how slavery starts out. It's not as bad at the beginning, but it gets worse as time goes on. Um, and then they eat horseradish to really like bring out the bitterness of slavery. Okay. But one of the things that they do is they mix the horseradish with, okay, so they also make a thing called karaseth, which is like apples mixed with honey and wine. And so they say that that's a picture. The Jewish people say that's a picture of the mortar that the Egyptians used, because they were making bricks and mortar in Egypt. Okay, and so what's interesting about, so that's kind of an interesting picture, because if the karaseth, the sweet karaseth, is a picture of the mortar, and then the bricks are like the hard thing. That picture in itself could be a picture of slavery, where you got the hard things, but there's kind of this sweetness mixed in, because then in the end times, when God rewards us for our slavery, then we'll see the sweetness, okay, that are in between all our trials and tribulations, okay. And then the other thing too is the Jewish people, they'll eat some of the horseradish, the bitter herb horseradish, with the karaseth, so kind of this mixing of, so, because how in the New Testament we read, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. Okay. So, so hang in there, because there's sweetness mixed in with the trials, and we definitely might not see it now when we're, in the middle of our trials. Okay. But when Jesus comes, it's going to be like we were dreaming. Okay. Because all of a sudden, all the trials are going to be turned into blessings. Okay. Um, so I just wanted to bring that up as an encouragement to you. To just, because the Jewish people talk about that when Jesus comes, then we will get our rewards. Okay. So we will get our rewards when Jesus comes for enduring under trial. Okay. So hang in there. I know it's hard. I know it's a tough time. So my prayers go out for, all of God's people that are suffering around the world. And, I pray for the Ukrainians. I pray especially for those that are in Exodus right now, trying to escape Ukraine, and, just pray that God would give you wisdom as to where He's asking you to go. And just for all the people that are currently suffering under trials, people with health issues, my prayers go out to you. I pray for God's grace and endurance, and So I just lift you all up in Jesus' name, and just God bless. I pray for God's grace for you and endurance, and so hang in there, because gosh, it's got to be really close. I just really can't imagine. I mean, we won't know until it gets fulfilled. Then we'll, like I said, when Jesus comes, we'll see more clearly. Then we'll know more. When we look at um, prophecy, um, we'll see how it's fulfilled. How God prophesied it ahead of time, and then we'll see how it gets fulfilled. Hang in there. So just pray for God's grace. If Jesus doesn't come back, I hope you still have a blessed Easter, knowing that we're waiting for the resurrection of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Easter, if it doesn't happen on Easter, Easter is definitely a big prophetic shadow of what is going to happen in the last days when our Lord and Savior Jesus returns. So hang in there. I really appreciate you listening. I hope you were encouraged by this. And God bless. Take care.